Welcome to the Man Rules Podcast. If you're looking to live with more intention, build connection, and live a more authentic, meaningful life, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dan Griffin. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that they keep changing the rules for us men without telling us. So each week, I just throw out the rule book and cover the tough topics about the real issues that men face. At the end of the day, I'm not here to tell you what kind of man you're supposed to be. I'm here to help you make your own rules and become the kind of man you want to be. So let's jump in. All right, well, welcome back to another episode of the Man Rules Podcast. I have my friend Rick Belden here, who we had an amazing conversation about the father's wound, and that was part of our Father's Month episodes. And today, just in fairness to the dichotomy that so many people have, we're going to talk about the mother wound. And it's very timely for both of us. So this should be a very interesting conversation. So Rick, welcome back.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be here.
Yeah, some people hear this thing, the father wound, the mother wound, and people are like, oh boy, that sounds a little goofy. The mother wound, what are we talking about here? And I've been one of those people. So let's just break it down into simple terms that even the most cynical can hear how this is something that so many of us deal with no awareness that it's affecting us.
Right. Actually, the way I'm going to start, Dan, is I'm going to reread the same definition that I started our father wound conversation with, and then I think we can kind of break it down and maybe get it into plainer language as we go.
Absolutely.
And this is from an article I posted a couple of years ago, I guess, on Huffington Post. It's called Men and the Mother Wound. It's a really good article about this topic. So as folks are listening, if they get to the end and they feel like they want to know some more about this, I could definitely recommend that they go there. I could read the whole thing and spend an hour just reading it, but we're going to have a conversation instead. But that's a good follow-up piece. And the way that article starts is with this definition. This is a definition that I'm using in my work for mother wound. A mother wound may be thought of as an injury to the psyche of a child resulting from significant dysfunction or disruption in relationship with the mother. In some cases, it is the result of a mother's absence or unavailability due to death, illness, adoption, or other circumstances that dramatically separate the child from the mother. But more typically, a mother wound is a complex of injuries the child's psyche received over many years, often as a result of the mother acting consciously or not out of her own woundedness. And Dan, I'm going to add one more sentence to this that I didn't read during the initial part of our father wound discussion. One of the most severe kinds of psychic wounding occurs when the child's primary function in the relationship is to be used by the mother to meet her own narcissistic needs.
Yeah, there's a great saying in family systems theory, or just in kind of understanding attachment between parents and children. And that is, in a healthy family system, the parents are there to meet the needs of the children. In an unhealthy family system, the children are there to meet the needs of the parent.
Yes, that is well observed.
Yeah. So this mother wound, I think this trips up a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people who have no problem saying, yeah, my father was a son of a bitch, man. And of course, there's some people who are like, their experience from childhood was that the mother was the one who was really, difficult or abusive, violent. And so for them, they really get this. But I think there's a bias in the language of wounds and abusiveness and trauma that's basically men cause trauma. Men are the perpetrators and women are victims. And even if women act out, it's only in defense and that sort of thing. And you and I both know better. But for me personally, right? So part of what I'm getting at, and my mom is still alive and she and I have had some conversations about this, but like we've worked through a lot of stuff. But my little 6-year-old didn't work through anything with my mom. And my 14-year-old didn't work through anything with my mom. And my 20-year-old didn't work through anything with my mom. That didn't start happening until later. And so part of what we were doing was just repairing and reconnecting but the grief and the pain and the trauma and the anger and the rage that I carried with me for so many years that I still have has been so powerful and has shown up in so many harmful ways in the way I connect with, view, relate to women. And man, I just could not see that shit.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I've gone through a similar process. In my situation, as a child in the family, it was my father who was invariably always acting out, who was angry, who would be mean-spirited and threatening and distant and so forth. And it was my mother, I hate to put it this way, she kind of pulled the good cop, bad cop thing a lot. So I was raised with the perception that she was the protector. She was the one that was keeping things under control. She was the one that was keeping him in check. He was the bad guy that was acting out. She was the good guy that was, keeping everything safe and stable and so forth. And so I very naturally, when I started becoming aware of how my experiences growing up in the family had adversely as an adult, it was very natural for me to go to the father work first, because he was the one that was the most visible. I always say he was the bull in the china shop with a target on his back. I mean, he just made it so obvious that his behavior was negative and affected me badly. And so that was the natural place to start. It wasn't until years and years and years of working through that stuff that I slowly began to develop an awareness that I might have some problems as a result of the way my mother behaved as well. But it was much harder for me to give myself permission to look at that.
So that makes complete sense to me. I mean, that was my experience, and other people saw it better than I did. And it's hard, it feels like a bit of a betrayal because my dad was horrible to my mom. So I mean, I have a lot of compassion and empathy, for my mom. Knowing how poorly treated she was, there's been a part of me for, at first especially, that was just kind of like, but she's been through so much. And I think there's this belief that says if I somehow acknowledge how I've been hurt by this other person, that contradicts the relationship, or that somehow doesn't have its place. And I think the other thing is that, what can pop up for people is like, in general, about the father wound and the mother wound is like, come on, you didn't have the perfect childhood, but so what? You're an adult now, get over it. You and I talked about this with the father wound, but I just think that's such a strong message for people. And it's just like, but the 6-year-old, the 8-year-old, that young part of you can't get over it, can't just get over it. I mean, more than ever, as a result of some of the healing work I've been doing in the past month or so, more than ever do I see the validity and the power that lies in making an effort to heal those wounded parts of us that are children, that are from our childhood and our adolescence, that can still have such a profound impact on our personality and our behavior.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll reshare the quote that I shared last time from John Sarno. The reason childhood things are a factor is because the unconscious has no sense of time.
Right.
So what is unresolved in the unconscious, regardless of, at what age it was laid in there, is just as alive and just as vibrant and just as real and feels just as present as something that happened in the last 5 minutes. And the older it is and the deeper it goes and the less attention has been paid to it, the louder it's going to get over time. And it's going to find ways to express itself in your life that may not be apparent. The mother wound stuff began to express itself in ways that were more apparent to me was in my relationship failures with women. It was in the course of observing those situations over time, and that I started to think that, okay, well, something doesn't appear to be right in the way that I'm interacting with these women, because I'm just coming out of this with a lot of pain, and I don't seem to be very successful in getting my needs met. I keep winding up with women that don't seem to have any sense of what my needs are. And if I'm able to even express them somewhat, it doesn't seem to have any impact. So that was happening, and then things started coming up in my dreams as well. I started noticing some things in my dreams, and I started working with a counselor who helped me kind of dive into that a little bit. About 7 years ago, I think I started with her, and she would just very gently redirect me back to, so how do you feel about, the way that your mom is presented in this dream? And I was very, very reluctant to express anything critical about my mom, for similar reasons, Dan. I mean, I saw the kind of situation she was in, and I felt like I was her ally. And so as her ally, I should be behind her 100% no matter what. But I had also noticed over the years that my interactions with her were less and less satisfying, and that even as an adult, I couldn't go to her and basically say, I'm feeling kind of unhappy with how things are with us right now, and I want to talk with you about it. And I would just get stonewalled, or I would get, everything's fine, there's nothing to talk about. So I was getting a lot of information through a lot of channels in parallel that finally kind of reached a critical mass, so to speak, where I started to open up to the possibility that yes, I have been wounded by my mother in ways that I have not seen and dealt with. And I want to actively commit to getting into that and learning about it so that I can get better.
I think one, there's a couple things. One, so I just want to say that, for our listeners, it should be really clear that Rick has done a lot of work. Rick is very committed to his own personal journey and has done a lot of work. So he comes with a wealth of wisdom that is gained through his experience and the reflection on his experience. And so I just want to honor that. And connected to that, I want a little bit of caretaking on my part, but I'm going to correct you because you started this off with just talking about your failures with women. And, I know that you're just coming out of something that's been tough. I would just encourage you to reframe it from the perspective of failures because, and I talk about this a lot, I mean, the way we're raised as men is so much about disconnection. Terry Real says the cost of disconnection for men is disconnection. And it's a very profound statement. It almost sounds absurd or something out of Alice in Wonderland, but it's true. There's real truth to that. And so I think any man who can go into a relationship consciously, and whether he makes mistakes or does things that he's not necessarily are in alignment with the man he wants to be, but can go in consciously and seek to meet the needs of another and have his needs met, that to me is success. And if the end result is not staying together, the end result is a shorter relationship, that's not failure. That's just simply saying that this was not the relationship for me, or I'm not ready or whatever. But I think there's a lot of men that struggle with that. And I talk about relationships all the time, and we can talk more about relationships. And it's all connected. It's all connected to the mother wound. I mean, my wife could see that piece for me much better than I could because she received it. She was impacted by it. There's so many men who are listening to this podcast, I'm sure, who don't truly understand that the way that they interact with women and the way that they interact with their daughters and the way they interact with their female colleagues could be very connected to the wounds they're still carrying from the unresolved pain in their relationship with their mom.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. I want to thank you, Dan, for what you said. I will acknowledge this, as I told you in our conversation before we started today, I'm extremely raw right now from a very fresh breakup. And the thing I'll add to it too is that, I felt much more clear during our conversation about the father wound because I'm so much farther along with that. The mother wound for me it's harder to talk about because I'm still sort of down there in it. The terrain is not fully mapped yet at this point. So this is a bit more of a challenging conversation for me in that respect. I would also say that, from my perspective, and this is one of the things that came up recently, I still tend to feel, because of the way I was conditioned in the relationship with my mother, that when I'm close emotionally with a woman, the closer I get, the more my needs seem to just recede into the horizon, to the point that I don't even sometimes know what they are anymore. Or if I do, I don't feel like it's really okay to state them. I have a lot of fear around that. So that's one of the ways it plays out for me. And so one of the ways it's played out in prior relationships is that I would get more and more resentful over time because I felt like I knew my needs weren't being met. I didn't really know how to state them. I tended not to state them because I felt like it wasn't really okay for me to have them. And of course, that's a very particular type of poison that will toxify a relationship and kill it.
Boy, so one, I just want to say that I'm coming out of some pretty raw stuff myself, and I guess that's part of life, especially if you try to live a conscious life. I think I hear what you're saying. I mean, I don't, when I have people on the podcast, and even as myself, this is a conversation. It's a conversation of exploration, and people have varying degrees of expertise. But quite honestly, there's not a lot of people talking about this. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, the rawness of it is real, and the work. I'm newer to this level myself. And so I'm sure there are people who are much farther along in this healing piece than I am. And I think that we all have something to offer to this if we're even just beginning to look at what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to begin to look at the mother wound? Like, for me, I had a very powerful conversation. I went into a program, and like I said, I had the privilege and the resources and the generosity of time and my family to be able to do this and to take a really, really deep look at some of the trauma in my life that has been bubbling up in recent months and has caused me a lot of pain. And it was so divinely orchestrated, this time in that program, that I just happened to be in DC for a training I was doing and staying with my mom, with my daughter. And I was able to talk to my mom about this and share with her some stuff I hadn't shared with her. But I was also able to look at her and say, Mom, this is not about my 73-year-old mom. I feel good and connected with you. We talk together as adults. Sometimes you still want to be my mom, quote unquote, but that makes complete sense. But this is about my mom when I was 6 and 12 and 15, and some of those key moments where she, because of her own degree to which she was engulfed in the misery and insanity of our family, just was not able to take care of me, was not, and didn't, I was able to look at her and say, Mom, but you didn't protect me. You didn't protect me from Dad. You didn't draw a line. You didn't say that it's not okay. You would even be complicit in it, in how you would hand me over to him in some respects, in his violence and in his rage and his criticism and his all of that. And I said, that's what I need to be able to heal from and let go of, because it's hurting the people I care about the most. And I couldn't see that. I didn't get the connection. So talk to our listeners about that connection, Rick. You shared a little bit about it, but give some real depth to that connection to somebody who's like not seeing how that makes sense, or not seeing how they could be doing this in their own life.
Yeah, I think I'm going to start off by sharing another short quote from someone on this subject. This fellow's name is David Shackleton. And he wrote, the mother wound is deeper than the father wound, because our relationship with our mother is the first and deepest relationship we make. That, of course, is why we did the father work first. It was easier. And so the working out of the mother wound will be harder and more distressing, and perhaps require more suffering before we are finished with it. Now, I didn't read that to discourage people. The point being that, for me, one of the easiest ways to understand what this is about and why it's important is the very first thing that he said. Our relationship with our mother is the first and deepest relationship we make. I have also put it this way, in particular in the context of how it's caused difficulties in my romantic relationships with women. That was the first woman I fell in love with. She was the only woman in the world to me for, the origin of my life and beyond, for many years. So it makes complete sense to me that I would take my experience with her and the patterns of perception and behavior and feeling that I first gained with her, and I would take those to the next one and the next one and the next one. And if I'm not conscious that I'm doing that, that whatever wasn't working in that relationship with her as a child is probably not going to work in very similar ways now for me as an adult in relationships with women, because I am, as an adult man, going to try to get my needs met in the same way that I learned how to try to get them met with my mother. And I guess that's what it always comes, for me, that's what this always comes back to, is the business of knowing what my needs are and being able to state them and feeling that it is safe and it's okay to have them and to state them and to expect that some effort be made to meet them. And so I think that an easy question for a man to ask himself if he's in a relationship with a woman is, do I know what my needs are? Is there a space in this relationship for me to state them? And to what extent are they getting met? And I guess the last question is, if they're not getting met, how do I feel about it? And how do I feel about it in terms of how that impacts the way that I behave with this woman that I'm with?
How foreign of an idea do you think it is for so many men still to this day that when you say, do I know what my needs are and do I know how to express them? How foreign do you think that is even as a concept for men, that they would have needs in a relationship?
For a lot of men, it's at space alien level.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying that half jokingly, but I mean, it is unfortunately true that, I mean, at some level, we all are aware of what our needs are. To the extent that we're more conscious about that and we feel we can express it and make some evaluations about whether they're being met or not, that's better for all our relationships. But as you said, I don't think, I mean, it took me a long time. I really didn't think, Dan, when I don't know, if a counselor, whoever would ask me about my needs, I'd be like, what needs? What are you talking about? And then the next step was to go, well, yeah, I have some needs, but is it really okay for me to bring those out and express those? Shouldn't she just know and just do it somehow? So there's a whole bunch of levels of sort of moving forward on this issue about, do I know what my needs are? Am I able to express them? Are they being met? What do I do when I express my needs to the woman in my life and she either doesn't seem to get it, or it doesn't seem important to her, or nothing changes? And as you said, I think these are all kind of unconscious dialogues that are going on with men all the time. They're just sort of below the level of awareness. And the result is that they wind up being resentful, being angry, being passive aggressive. Maybe they start looking for somebody else. So I think men can be keenly aware of the effects, but I don't know how aware they are of what underlies the behavior that comes out of it.
Yeah, the connections between the two. And you said something that I think part of the unwritten mythology in a lot of heterosexual relationships is that women are better at relationships. And so they just inherently understand men's very limited needs. Our needs are so few and far between anyways. We just need to be able to, have food, fuck, fight when we need to, and watch sports or something. I mean, it's so degrading and disrespectful in some ways how our experience in relationships has been so relegated to such a limited capacity. But then also this myth, this idea that women just are so relational, inherently understand how to do that. And, the women that I love and that, who I'm really connected to, they're the ones who are going to be the most honest and be able to say, I don't have a clue. I can barely meet my own needs. I mean, the truth is I struggle emotionally. I struggle to meet my own needs. And part of the woman rules says, meet the needs of everybody other than yourself. So to show up as two mature human beings who can meet their own needs and be treated and respected and expected to take care of themselves and not have to take care of someone else, I think is a foreign concept for so many of us. But for men to really give themselves permission to have needs, to be able to verbalize their needs, to set boundaries around those needs, and to be able to, what I called in my last book, stand up gently to people, especially women, when those needs are not being met or boundaries are being crossed. And I think so many of us men, I know for me, I feel so vulnerable and, in parentheses, read weak, when I want to talk to my partner about my needs and when I want to share with her the boundary issues, that I come across as controlling, I come across as dogmatic, I come across as laying down the law. And some of it's because I'm so scared. And it doesn't excuse that behavior because it's not okay. It's not okay to be that controlling in the relationship. But the truth is, I'm so used to not having my needs acknowledged or met or validated by myself that the idea that somebody else is going to do it is its own challenge. And it's been a huge part of my maturing in my marriage and my relationship and us being able to hear one another, but me being quiet enough so that I can be heard without it being felt to be intimidated or not safe.
Yeah, I wish you could have seen my face when you were talking about that part, because I was really smiling here because I don't know, maybe a lot of us as men have our own version of that. I tend to stiffen up and armor up myself around those kind of conversations because I'm not sure it's safe. I typically wait till I feel backed into a corner before I'll say, well, wait a minute, this isn't really what I want. Or, I have some sort of stake in this too. I just kind of fold and fold and fold until I can't fold anymore. And at that point, I'm really compressed. And, when it comes across that way. I also want to follow up. I'm glad you brought up boundaries because that's such an important thing too. For me, I find with women that I care about, that I feel emotionally intimate with, romantically and so forth, it's very, very hard for me to set boundaries. There's a part of me that's just convinced inside that if I say no, she's going to go away. And if I say no, then it's going to hurt her. That's the other part of it for me. I become completely focused on the emotional feeling experience of the woman to the exclusion of what I'm feeling. And it doesn't take much for me to go right into caretaking mode 100%. As a matter of fact, I had an experience recently where I basically started by saying, I'm upset about something. And the conversation kind of boiled down to, well, now that you're upset, I'm upset. And I completely flipped over to caretaking her upset. And when it was all over, I realized it's like, we didn't even really finish with the thing I started with. And again, since we're talking about mother wound, I can trace all these patterns back to the relationship I had with the child as my mother, as my mother. Well, there's a slip for you. Yeah, well, there you go. We could branch off on that too, I guess. But for me, where this all kind of reached critical mass for me, Dan, was back about a year and a half ago. I had finished a contract job, a tech job, and had a very difficult female boss. I had convinced myself at one point that if I just didn't date anymore, that I wouldn't have unpleasant experiences with women. That was just not right. I kept having unpleasant experiences with women as like next door neighbors and bosses and so forth. So I finished that contract and I started moving deeper into this mother wound stuff. And I was actually looking at a website called narcissisticmother.com, which is a good site for people to check if they think perhaps there might be an issue of narcissism or narcissistic behavior from their mom that might be affecting them. And there was a little test on the site to sort of a little self-test to determine, to what extent your mother might have been narcissistic and to what extent it might be affecting you. And so I took this thing, and you get scored from out of 105 points, I scored 89. So your total score indicates your mother's narcissism has had and continues to have an extremely traumatic impact on you. I was astounded. And then I read a little bit further into the site, and I came across a post, and the very first sentence in the post was, now that you understand that your mother is narcissistic. And I just broke down crying. It was totally unexpected. And that was the beginning of a very deep 4-month-long process where I just had the time and I had the opportunity, and it was right there to do the work. I just committed myself to, okay, I'm going to get down into this mother wound stuff, and I'm going to try to understand it and clear stuff out. And grieving for me, I am convinced, probably for other people, such an important part of clearing this out. Grieving not having had the mother that I needed. And you can do that regardless of whether your mother, did a good job, a great job, or somewhere in between. To some extent, none of us had the mother that we needed. And to the deeper that goes, the more work there is to do, but the more benefit you can get out of it.
Yeah.
And one of the big insights on that just came to me one day was I was just taking a walk after I'd done some work on this. And all of a sudden it just hit me. My mom is a separate person than I am. She has her own life. She has her own history. She had her own childhood, and we're not the same person. And that was huge because I didn't even know up to that point that deep inside myself, there was no boundary between me and her. Her experience was my experience. What she felt was what I felt. That's the way that I was conditioned as a child. And until I did this work, I could not be a separate individual. And I had just turned 57 when I had that experience. But it was profound. It wasn't an intellectual experience. It was a complete, full body, full existence, full soul experience of all of a sudden. And that was magical, Dan, because at that point, a lot of the resentment that I had toward her just left me. Because for the first time, I could see her pain as hers and not mine. And I realized I'm not responsible for all that stuff. And just such a weight was lifted. And like I said, all of a sudden, it's kind of like the process I talked about going through with my dad, where I actually got to see him as a separate person that existed before I did and all that kind of stuff. But this time there was a lot that was lifted because I have spent my entire life up to that point feeling like I was responsible for her, for what happened to her. I wanted to save her. I never wanted her to feel bad about anything. And so that was a huge, huge transformational point for me. Now, in my recent experience, in my most recent attempt at a relationship, I can see there's still work to do. But I was in a better position than I ever had been before because I had done the work on my mother wound and reached a point where I could actually release her and release myself from that deal that was sort of forced upon me when I was an infant, that we were the same person and I was responsible for her.
And you said so many important pieces, and one of the ones I really want to kind of nail down is this one of the patterns of behavior and how they show up in other relationships. And my experience with my mom was so similar in the sense of like that idea. I felt what she felt. I was so emotionally, I've always been very empathic and never really known how to own it, especially as a man. And with my mom, I felt what she felt, and that shows up in my relationships with other women. And when I feel what they feel, but it's also like this really interesting combination of I feel what they feel, and then there's this shame as though I caused it. And so then there's this sense of like, okay, they're feeling sad, and I take that on as my responsibility. I take that sadness on. Then I feel the shame around that sadness. I've caused that sadness. Then that shame leads me to act out with anger and shaming them. It's just like it can just get so convoluted and crazy. And so some of it is slowing down and having the awareness. And some of it is looking at those originating wounds. So for those folks who are listening, you identify as heterosexual or not, if you find yourself constantly in and out of relationships where especially with women, and whether it's you struggle with a boss or you struggle with a partner, you struggle in an intimate relationship, but if you find that there's these types of relationships that keep happening, then this mother wound that Rick is talking about could have some real validity. The grief is so incredibly important. I've started to really touch that grief, and it started with me being able to write a letter, me being able to just write a letter saying, this is what I needed, this is what I didn't get. And I know from some people, the way they're going to hear that from the lens or through listening of like the man roles where like that's whining or like that's lame or that. But the truth is it's like that quote you shared earlier. This is for the adult. Yes, that's true. but it's really giving voice to that part of me that had no capacity to have that voice at that time and to say, no, this is what you should be doing. This is exactly what I needed. And the last thing I'll say, and then I want to kind of move into our kind of final pieces, but you talked about how this enables us to see our moms as human, as imperfect. And I think that's so critical. There's a freedom that comes from this when we begin to do this work, where we really get to see our mothers and our fathers are just human beings. They're not evil. I mean, I guess maybe some people, their parents really were evil, but I mean, for the most part, our parents were just very imperfect, probably traumatized individuals who unintentionally passed their wounds and their trauma down into a generation. And we can, when we give ourselves permission to grieve what we didn't get, when we give ourselves permission to have that pain and own it and not blame it on anybody else, then we're free.
Yes, and I will add to that, and this hadn't occurred to me until I was just listening to you. The other thing that comes out of that is not only do you see, so for me, not only am I able to see my mom more fully now as a separate person, as an individual that has her own life, who's autonomous and all that sort of thing. I found in this most recent situation with this woman who I care very much for, what I found was that rather than feeling like I wanted her to change her behavior, for the first time I felt like, no, I actually don't want her to change her behavior. I want her to be who she is. But part two is, at a certain point, being who she is and doing what she wants and needs to do, it's not working for me.
Yeah.
And so I need to stop. But there was no point where I felt strongly that I wanted to change who she was or change what she was doing. And I tried to be very clear with her about that. And the other thing I'll follow up really quick, when you talked about feeling like you're responsible for the woman's feelings, for whatever feeling state she's in, the first time I cried after the breakup yesterday morning, I cried for 15 minutes. And it wasn't about how I felt. It was about how I was afraid she felt.
Well, there you go. That's more of the, but you see that. And you, like me, are so committed to sharing those experiences and those lessons to others that they might get it sooner.
Hopefully. Yeah.
And we're getting it right when we're supposed to as well.
Right.
So I knew this would be a great conversation, man. Like with the father's wound, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg. But I think our listeners really, really appreciate the practical and the tactical, this idea of what are some actionable steps that they can take to really begin to look at this. So if you would, give me 3, 5, whatever. I mean, just a number of actions that those people who are listening who are wondering, maybe this does apply. Maybe some lights are coming on and they're saying, gosh, I really do struggle in this with women. And I guess I've always thought it was the women. Boy, I never thought it was my mom. I mean,
right.
Or I haven't seen my mom in this long, or I don't talk to my mom, or my mom and I are so close. I hear that a lot.
Yes.
My mom and I are so close. So what would be your practical and tactical takeaways for our listeners?
Okay, I do have 3. And this is, I think that, again, for me, kind of reflecting on my story, my initial approach to my own mother wound work was very sort of gently exploratory, because it is so taboo and it is so complicated and it feels downright dangerous for a lot of us. So I wrote down 3 things, and these are about, again, kind of just beginning to explore what your attitudes and your perceptions and your feelings and beliefs are. So first topic is anger with your mother. Is it acceptable? And this is just some questions to ask yourself, and you can journal a little bit, or you can draw a picture, or you can have a conversation with your partner or whatever. So first of all, anger with your mother. Is it acceptable for you to feel angry with or critical of your mother? Are you even aware of these feelings in yourself? If so, what do you do with them? If not, can you imagine what it might be like to have them and how you might feel about it? Is there emotional space in your relationship with her to express such feelings, or do you feel the need or the requirement to cover and hide them? Second topic, telling her no. Do you feel it's okay to tell your mother no when she wants something, including your time and attention, that either you don't want or don't have to give her? What sorts of thoughts and feelings come up for you if you imagine saying no to her in a situation in which you've wanted to but never have? Third one is about after effects of your interaction with her. How do you feel after you've interacted with her, whether in person, by phone, email, or whatever? Better, worse, or the same? How are you the next day? Do you ever notice any changes in mood that seem out of place or mysterious to you?
That's great. Those are awesome because of the exploratory nature of them, and they're so kind of at just this dipping your toe in the water to just of awareness and paying attention to that. And I think it's a wonderful way to do it. For some of our other listeners, I would add to that, and I know you believe in this too, but maybe if you're at a slightly different place, the benefit of writing a letter to your mom, not that you give her, whether she's alive or dead, whether you're close to her or not, but the benefit of writing a letter to your mom is unbelievable. If you can not censor it, and if you can write it from the perspective of the child or the adolescent and not just the adult, and give yourself permission to write whatever letter needs to be right and say whatever needs to be said. We do this in the trainings that I do, and I always say, you can't write the wrong letter, but you can write the easy letter.
Yes.
And that's what I encourage people to think about. So, Rick, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, people are always welcome to visit my website, which is rickbelden.com. That's rickbelden.com.
Awesome. And you're on Twitter, and you're very active on Twitter, which I appreciate. I'm still learning how to do that, active on social media, and they can find all that on your website as well. You have a lot of great writings. You've done several articles for Huffington Post, so I encourage people to check those out. I don't want to cut this off before you've had a chance to share one of your poems. And the one that you shared with me ahead of time brought tears to my eyes, and probably because it's so much to where I am right now. But would you mind sharing that?
No, I'd be happy to do that. And thank you for letting me know that, Dan. It means a lot. This is from my third book, which along with my second book is not yet published. So this isn't something that a lot of people have seen or heard. And it touches on the importance of grieving as part of this process of clearing and healing your mother wound in your relationship with your mother. The title is The Grief I Will Not Let Myself Feel. I've never grieved my first love, the one who brought me here. Never cried for losing her. Never shed a tear. The grief I will not let myself feel for her occupies its own universe within me. It has its own culture, its own history, its own language, its own physics. It recreates itself automatically and repeatedly in the outer world. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is epic, mythic, immense as the Milky Way, but it's lost somewhere far inside me, like a ghost ship with a broken compass, traveling in endless circles in a dense fog. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is buried in the safety of anger. I hold that anger tight in my teeth. I use it to try to plug the lifetime of holes she's left in my psyche, but the pain keeps leaking out. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is deep, profound, and frightening. It's the monster under the bed, the shark stalking the swimmer, the mugger waiting in a dark alleyway. It's a hydra tree with heads for leaves and tangled roots that she set like fish hooks in my embryonic heart. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is locked up high in the tower of a castle with a drawbridge gate guarded by an infant. He guards that gate with his life because he knows that my entry into that tower of unfelt grief means the end of her, and he's convinced he can't live without her and doesn't want to.
Thank you, Rick. It's a powerful conversation, but I hope our listeners also understand it takes courage to put this out there the way you do. And so I hope people take some time to reflect on how this may or may not apply to you in your relationships with your mom and with other women in your life. I really want to thank Rick for joining me again for another wonderful podcast. I want to thank our listeners for listening and for supporting the podcast. And Rick, any final comments?
Yes, absolutely. Ultimately, this is hopeful. This is not a dire situation where you go down into it and it's just dark and hard and nothing ever gets better. That poem I read was written before I did my deepest work, where I was able to separate from her and all this stuff. This can absolutely get better. No, I didn't. My latest relationship didn't succeed, but I'm better and I'm learning and I'm not doing the same things over and over again. So if you're listening and this sounds like it's just too much, it's too complicated, it's going to take too long, the fact is this is all about a hopeful outcome. And I believe that with every fiber of my being.
One step at a time, one day at a time. Rick, thanks so much. And again, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Man Rules Podcast, where we don't let the rules rule us. If you're enjoying this podcast and our guest, please take a moment to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you may be listening, and let others know about our podcast as well. If you have ideas for guests, topics, or even would like to be a guest, send us an email at ideas@themanrules.com. Check out our website and everything we're up to at themanrules.com. Because the only question we have to ask is what kind of man you want to be and what's keeping you from being that man.